Hey team, this week we talked to Dr. Paul Wood and it's a massive episode. At the age of 18, he was convicted of murder and spent the best part of a decade behind bars in some of New Zealand's toughest prisons. But while he was there, he started an education journey which saw him complete an undergraduate and a master's degree, and now he's out in the real world. He's a doctor of psychology and he's changing lives.
Yeah, Paul is super impressive. He's one of New Zealand's best speakers and spends his time travelling up and down the country telling his story. One of our challenges was getting something different out of him, and we definitely did in this one. It got emotional in a number of periods, incredibly thought-provoking, and just a great chat. Strap in, this one's a belter. This episode is brought to you by TAB. Download the new app today and get your bet on. Dr. Paul Wood, welcome to Between Two Beers.
Stoked to be here.
We are very excited to have you in studio. We were just chatting before. We're going on a journey today, aren't we?
We sure are. Who knows where it'll go? I certainly don't. But yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah. So we thought we might start with a morning routine. We've been talking to some sources and they suggest you might have an interesting one, and fans of Between Two Beers are quite invested in the whole morning routine. What was your morning routine?
Well, you're an experimenter, aren't you? So you're into it.
Full Instagram guru, we've heard. alpha mode. Is that because you sent us an email at 5:30 this morning?
Yeah, I actually held off for a bit.
Did you?
That was
What time are eyes open?
About 4:30.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and, I normally like to be in bed about the same time as the kids as a result. You got to be getting that sleep, but I love getting up early and exercising. Obviously, exercise is a standard thing, but I have a morning protocol that I've worked out over years of experimentation in terms of what works for me. And so what I do is after I've exercised, I sit down. By that time in the day, hopefully the sun might be out so I can get some sunlight into my eyeballs, generate one of those great cortisol pulses, get my hormones going so that I'll have more energy during the day. And I have a sheet, like a template that I use, and on it I write down 5 things that I'm grateful for. One of those things, by the way, will be something that I'm proud of about myself in the last 24 hours. It is more common for people to be their own biggest critic than their own best cheerleader. In fact, one of the most common deathbed regrets people have is, I wish I'd let myself be happier. We're so good at picking up on the things we don't like about ourselves and beating ourselves with that rod. And it's really important to gather evidence of who we can be at our best, even in just really little ways. And it is just really little ways. Maybe it's things like, instead of telling the kids off for not getting ready for bed in time, I walked out of the room and did some tactical breathing or something like that. Or maybe it's instead of smashing that whole packet of Tim Tams, I only ate half the pack. But these small little things that we do, it's really important to gather the evidence of that to help us really grow into it and maintain the momentum on being the best version of ourselves. Personal identity is a really porous thing. It's heavily influenced by perception, by environment, by the company you keep, all sorts of stuff. And so for my personal identity, I want to be associating myself with who I can be at my best. So that's part of what I do there. The other things are more just general things. And, a lot of people have heard of gratitude diaries, that sort of stuff. Most people start them and give up on them very quickly because they fail to realize that it's not about immediate return on investment. It's not about going, I'm grateful that I had a coffee in the morning. I'm grateful that, I'm just floating away on positive emotion. It's not about that. It's like going to the gym for your brain. What you're doing is you're recalibrating your radar over time so that you pay attention to and notice more of those little things as they happen. And that's when you get the positive return. It's not when you're doing the exercise of the list. It's to recalibrate that radar, and it takes about 21 days on average for most people to notice the benefit. But most people give up way before then. So that's one of the things I do. And, I've done that on and off, but I've done it consistently for a few years now, and it really does make a difference to me. Another thing I do as well is I identify a value that I'm going to live into that day. And that's sort of like an identity goal. Identity goals are about who you want to grow into and be. And they're the most motivating type of goal. We normally focus on outcome goals, which is, I want to run a marathon, or I want to lose 5K, or I want to get a promotion. And most people who focus on those goals, and that's what we've been taught to do historically, they'll achieve them, and then they'll lose the momentum on them. They'll run a marathon, then they'll stop running as much. They'll lose the weight, and then they'll regain the weight, all of these sorts of things. Whereas if you really want to sustain change, you're better off thinking about, who do I want to grow into as a person? And the example of that with the running example would be, instead of going, I want to run a marathon, you go, I'm going to be a runner. And that's my identity. And as a consequence of focusing on that identity goal, I'll be able to run marathons, but I won't stop doing it.
Yeah.
So,
I remember, I can relate to, do you remember having this conversation about drinking?
Yeah.
I think I'd read it, I think Atomic Habits or something like that.
James Clear, brilliant,
And it was about who you identify with. And I was like, Shay, just, you're not a drinker. Just say you're not a drinker. Like, don't drink and then become that.
Yeah. That framing is really interesting. Like that just that language shift.
Yeah.
Like, I've got real issues with the term sober. I used to pull Stephen up on it all the time. He's like, Shay's sober now. It's like, no, I'm not sober, because for me it was like I had a drinking problem, which I don't think I did.
Yeah.
It was I'm a non-drinker now. I just don't drink anymore. And it was really important for me to kind of distinguish that difference.
The language you use is so important, because I'm not drinking this year. I mean, I'm tempted to say, unless I'm in Italy, I mean, limoncello, man, it's like, that's an exception. But for me, it's not about like being a non-drinker or being sober. It's, I want to be a weapon.
Yeah.
And what does a weapon do? A weapon doesn't do things that interfere with its sleep, that stop it from being able to have the emotional regulation that really helps you experience the best of emotions and manage the more difficult ones. And so for me, that's just part of that. But you've got to find that thing. What is that identity in myself, which is just inconsistent with drinking?
Just on that, the terminology you use and living those values, do you have like a subset
priority set
that you use?
6. Yep.
Like today I'm going to be this, today I'm going to be this, and you've got like a list of 10 of them that you kind of interchange?
I have a list of 6 priority values that I'm using at this point, and those values might shift and change, but I will choose one for the day. So say, for example, the value that I chose today was appreciation. I want to be a really appreciative person of my life, of the people I come into contact with, of the opportunities I have. And so that's who I am today. I'm like the person who's dialing up my appreciation at all points. But what I'll also do is I won't just choose that. As part of my template, I have this, what are the opportunities to live into that I'll encounter today? The more effectively we can cast forward and visualize when, where, and with whom we'll get the chance to do something, the easier it is to implement that action. Whereas if I just go, I'm going to be appreciative today, and then I just go get on with my day being busy, it's way harder to nail that. Whereas if in advance I go, okay, well, look, I'm going to visit a prison today, I'm going to do this podcast today, I'm going to do these things. And when I'm engaged in that, I'm going to be really focused on maximizing my appreciation, just feeling that gratitude, all of that stuff. It's way easier to do that. So that's the identity goal. But I also have a process goal that I use every day.
I feel like you'd get on really well with Di Foster. You're talking Di Foster's language.
Right.
Yeah.
And so process goals, of course, are the systems or habits that actually help you live into those identity goals. And for me, I choose one of the 3 core Stoic disciplines every day that I'm going to really live into and really going to use as a process to help me get through what I need to. And I'll normally choose that based on the type of day I think I've got ahead of me. And so the 3 key sort of core Stoic disciplines, one is to see things for what they are. We have our natural perception, our narrative, where we filter and interpret everything. What's good? What's bad? How should I feel about this? How should I feel about that? What did that mean? We have this narrative that we tell ourselves that makes sense of the world. And seeing things for what they are is having the ability to step out of that and go, no, I'm not going to assign value judgments to this. I'm not going to put myself in the middle of this and make everything about me. I'm going to try and have this more objective, broader perspective of what's going on and what different things mean. So that's one of them. Another one of them is to do what I can. Now, in the Stoic context, that's normally around do what you can in terms of how you contribute to others and how you actually sort of like have a productive day as part of that as well. So do what I can. And then the third one is to endure and bear what I must. And I love that, you know? I love that idea because that's like, it's like armor, right? If you go into it going, I'm up for it, come at me, you know, bring it on, whatever that is, that's such a cool feeling. It's such a cool feeling to feel empowered, you know, like you're ready for it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's sort of the morning protocol there. And normally I make the kids' lunches as well because I'm up first if I'm at home.
Yeah.
And my wife often quality controls those, which is fair enough.
That is the most comprehensive answer for the morning routine.
Oh, sorry about that,
And
No,
gives,
this is a vibe. This is a vibe.
and gives an insight, I think, into what we're going to enjoy for the rest of the
wicked.
conversation, because it's set a pretty high benchmark in terms of the areas we're going to delve into.
Yeah, I'm liking where this is going. It's going to be, we said it's going to be a journey. Like, I don't know where this one's going to go. It's a
Yeah.
little bit different to normal. But I did want to sort of front foot up front, an interesting situation we're in. You have this story, right? This incredibly well-told story. There's a TED Talk you did over a decade ago that's had tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of views. And it's kind of the bedrock of what happens afterwards. And you're one of New Zealand's most in-demand speakers. You must have told the story of prison to PhD hundreds, if not thousands of times. For our audience, most people will be tuning in and they won't know your story. So we are going to get you to tell it. But I wanted to talk to you about, do you feel trapped by the story?
Yeah, man.
That you've escaped from. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is actually the title of my best-selling book about it, How to Escape from Prison, right? But it's a really interesting one. So I got out of prison a long time ago. I spent 10 years, 10 months in prison from 18 to 29. So I'm not 29 anymore for anyone who's not able to see, you know, this fresh face. You know, I'm 48 next week. So it's been a while since I've been out. And I'm a professional who's focused on building my skill set. You know, my area is psychology. I love, you know, running workshops and leadership resilience, all that sort of stuff. I love doing that. And there have been many occasions where I've been preparing to do keynotes or other things where my story's part of, you know, what's going to be used as a thread to communicate more universal takeaways and ideas for people, but it's an engaging thread. And I've been like, I don't want to do this really. You know, I'm sick of telling this same story. It's just so not who I am now, what I'm going back to. However, what keeps me doing it is the feedback I get from people who hear it for the first time. So for me, I'll do a conference keynote and then afterwards I'll be talking to people and someone will come up or maybe more than one person will come up and talk to me about the positive impact that they just got from hearing me speak. And every time I hear that, I feel a bit emotional even thinking about it, right? But every time I hear that, I'm like, that was worth it for that person. Oh, God. You know, it's a cool thing to be able to turn your mistakes into something that can positively impact other people. And so even though I can be a little bit like, oh, gosh, you know, I'd rather not be doing this. I'd rather be at home with my kids. I'd rather be running a workshop where it's not about my background. The feedback that I get from people is what keeps me doing it, because I don't need to be doing it. And, yeah.
Can I just pick up on that? Do you often get emotional when retelling or thinking about parts of the story?
Well, there are different elements, right? Because like I don't talk about the same thing every time. I don't get emotional when I think about the prison bits or that bit. What tends to get me emotional is when I think about some of the more positive things, like if I think about my kids or I'm making reference to that or how lucky they are with their lives in terms of the opportunities they get or positive impacts on other people. When I think about that stuff, I struggle to regulate my emotions. I think this is a bit of a hangover from having been so long in prison, actually. Like, you know, one of the things that you can experience through institutionalization is actually difficulty regulating your emotions. And I was reflecting on this. I've reflected on this a number of times that if you confront me with hard stuff, I'm all good. Okay, it'll have no emotional impact on me, or no emotional impact that'll be detrimental to me. You know, if you put me in a situation that's dangerous, if you show me some misery or some suffering, that's kind of like my comfort zone in terms of my early experience of life, and definitely prison. But if I watch a movie, Mel's Last Dancer or something, or, Extreme Home Makeover or Undercover Boss or something, I'm like, my wife regularly will look at me and go, are you crying?
Yeah.
Because when positive things happen for people, that's where I struggle with the emotions, actually, I think. And so, again, when I think about having a positive impact, that sort of thing, I'll often get emotional when I think about that stuff. But, yeah, not about the story itself, if that makes sense.
This is going to put our listeners in a weird position because they're going to be like, what the fuck is this guy's story? What are we talking about his story?
Okay.
Like, what's his story?
Yeah.
So I'm going to put it over to you in whichever way you want to tell it, but give us the...
Yeah, so, I ended up in prison when I was 18, was arrested for and subsequently convicted of murder. And it's taken me years to even be able to say that word. I would always avoid it previously. I would say, for killing someone, but I couldn't bring myself to say it until relatively recently, actually, because it is the truth. But it's so inconsistent with how I see myself and how I saw myself then as well. But the reality is that I ended up in a situation where I chose to take actions that unnecessarily ended someone else's life, and I should have known that those actions were unnecessary at that point and that they were likely to cause death. And as a result, I ended up getting convicted of murder. I had lots of decisions that led me to that situation in the first place. By that point in my life as an 18-year-old, I was addicted to drugs. I was making high-risk decisions on a daily basis in terms of that drug habit. And, one of those decisions was to catch up with someone who was a drug dealer, and there was nothing unusual about that. However, as a result of that interaction, they ended up dead, and I ended up spending 10 years, 10 months behind bars. And I was blessed with the opportunity to be able to realize I was on the wrong path in my life when I was in prison, and therefore make changes, pursue an education that enabled me to be sitting here today rather than on the revolving door of re-imprisonment that so many people get caught on. And, I consider myself really lucky. The person who I killed, Boyd, had I been the person who had died that day, people would have done to me the same thing they did to him, and that's, to say, good riddance to bad rubbish, one criminal kills another criminal, no loss to society, and that would have been absolutely fair enough. But I've had the opportunity to change my life, of course, whereas he never will. It's interesting because over the years I've really struggled, actually, with really feeling regret for my actions. So, he was someone who was taking advantage of people. He was, I think, it's fair to say, a sexual predator, and he would get people hooked on drugs and he would take advantage of the situation. And when I ended up in prison at 18, I blamed him and I blamed everyone else for my situation. I certainly didn't take ownership of it. I said, he attacked me in my home. And I would get all these messages from people that would help reinforce this victim mentality. I would have guards say to me, good job, I would have done the same thing. I had a prison psychologist once say to me, I've had to work with lots of people who have come in here who have been victims of that guy. You're way better off being in here for killing him rather than having been a victim of him. So I'd get all these messages that would make it hard for me to really feel regret and really take ownership of that. And so as part of my change and part of my development, I would think about that a lot, and I would think about it in an intellectual way where I'd think, okay, well, look, I deprived him of the chance to change. He was someone's brother, he was someone's son, so I would think all these things, but that's quite an intellectual approach to trying to cultivate regret, whereas I actually had an experience quite recently that really shifted that for me. So I got contacted by someone on Facebook, as you do, right, on Facebook, and they had come across my book about my story, and their husband had been given it, and they said, oh, as soon as their husband brought it home and they saw it, they knew exactly what it was about because they're good friends with the family of my victim, with Boyd's family and his siblings. And they said they'd read the book and they noticed in the epilogue that I'd said I'm always open to meeting the family if it would be useful for them for the interests of restorative justice. And so they said, look, one of the family members would like to do that. I won't mention any more details around who that was, but one of them would like to catch up with you. And of course, I immediately thought, I shouldn't have put that in the book, oh, geez, that's not like something you look forward to doing, right? And I'm busy like everyone else, I'm busy with my life and my kids. But of course, that's such a good illustration, though, of how doing the right thing isn't always doing the easy or convenient thing, eh? And so I arranged to catch up with them. And it was a really powerful experience for me. Very quickly in the conversation, what I became aware of as a result of their sharing was the horrendous sexual abuse that he had experienced as a kid growing up, the guy I killed. And as a father, it just completely changed my perception of him. He went from being this person who I only knew as this villain whose life I had taken to this kid who ended up living a life which was just so the product of the experiences they had had growing up. And I felt a real shift in me where I felt a completely different emotion around the regret for my actions. But also as well, I do a lot of stuff in my life, like some of the pro bono stuff I do in the justice sector and that, which is kind of like a way for me to have a positive impact through my experiences. But now when I do that stuff, I feel like I carry him with me, that I'm not just doing it for my redemption or benefit, but also for his. And that's a very different thing and a feeling than this intellectual sort of regret. Yeah. So that got intense very quickly.
Well, it's an incredibly complex situation because I also wanted to ask, I know you've grappled with the term murder.
Yeah.
And I've noticed in interviews, even naming your victim, you do it very sparingly. And I wondered whether speaking the name personifies them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's easier not to, right? Because it's easier to avoid that stuff. It's depersonalization. The more you can depersonalize people you've done harm to, the easier it is to reconcile your actions and not have to deal with the reality of them. I mean, it's a classic thing that's done in warfare, right? Anytime there's a war going on, there will always be dehumanizing labels that are used for the enemy because it makes it easier to not see them as people. And so that's certainly something I've did. And again, I think that's one of the reasons I made the deliberate choice a little bit earlier to say Boyd rather than to just say my victim, because I think that is an important thing for me to do. Yeah.
It is complex because you're doing the work, right? Most people that go to jail, I imagine, for murder, for manslaughter, whatever it is, they don't come out the other end and be a public speaker about what they've done and what they've turned their life into.
Yeah.
So you are constantly revisiting it and learning and growing and evolving. And the emotion you've shown, I imagine that's more recent, right? After the meeting.
Yeah. It's interesting, and I think I've been very lucky in terms of the environment I've been able to leave prison and go into, and that has made such a difference in terms of my ability to grow and develop and try and be a positive contributing member of society. And so much of that is about good fortune as opposed to being unique characteristics to me. And I've got to say, there are certainly other people who I know, who I'm aware of, who have gotten out and who are living good, positive, contributing lives and not doing anything wrong, but they're smart enough to stay under the radar, and not be talking about this stuff. But for me, this is kind of one of the ways in which I try and pay back all of the additional opportunity and support that I've had, is not by just getting on with my life and just quietly, having my business and doing what I do, because that was a choice that I had. I was out for a long time before my story was public knowledge, before Wendy Murdoch from the Dominion, published the story once I got my PhD. And, she was amazing. She was a journalist with so much integrity in terms of how she approached that.
Was it 5 years she said on the story?
Yeah. She had approached me very early on, and I was employed by a company at that point, Opera Consulting Group as it was, which gave me this opportunity, but they had big contracts with the police and with corrections. As part of my job, I never managed those relationships. I never did work for those organizations, so there was no conflict of interest. However, had it come out in the media that they were employing someone with my background, then that could have potentially been an issue for them, where I would have had to resign, and then, there goes this great path that I'm on in terms of building the skills necessary to be a functioning member of society. And so she agreed to hold on until my PhD was finished, and I was wildly optimistic at that point that that would be a year. And then every year she would re-catch up with me and go, how are we going? But honestly, her level of integrity around sitting on that and doing that for the right reasons, because had that story come out then, there would have been a whole lot of people who would have said, okay, great, we've got an educated criminal, as opposed to going, oh, this is a really good thing. And that would have been fair enough, because I hadn't had enough time out to prove that actually, I really had changed my life and I was trying to live a positive life. I think you need to get a lot of runs on the board before you really reach the point where people will accept that who might be more skeptical, understandably. And so she allowed that to happen. And then by the time the story came out, I'd had enough work experience, had enough skill set in my craft that I was in a position where I could, move on and do my own thing and not have to worry about my background being a problem for that company.
There's a lot to talk about of what you're doing, the work you're doing at the moment, but I want to sort of trace the journey through prison, because the man you came out the other end was very different to the 18-year-old that went in. Yeah. And that change, right? Changing who you are, changing mindset, sort of identity, I feel like it's all wrapped into it. So can you tell us about your journey of going in and on your way out?
Yeah. I mean, going in, it was such a predictable thing, really. In fact, I'd been arrested by the police as soon as I turned 17. The police had arrested me, and one of them had said, we're going to have you in prison before you're 20. Don't you worry about that. Because I had gone from youth court before that, and I had been someone who had been easily influenced by people around me. And I'm not saying that as an excuse. I literally just am someone who has a high need for social approval. I mean, we all do as members of a social species want people to like us, but I'm someone who has like a particular need to be liked and accepted by others. And that makes me very, it made me very prone to manipulation when I was younger. And so I used to associate with someone in particular who used to be like, oh, hey, you're worst case scenario, you're only going to youth court for this. And so they would use me to commit crimes on that basis. And the police knew this, and they were waiting for that point to arrest me as soon as I turned old enough to be going to adult court. And then they'd said to me, oh, you're going to be in prison. So it's not like it was a surprise to anyone, right? No one who really sort of like knew me or spent time around me. And I don't come from a bad family background at all. However, my parents were busy with my mum dying at this time. So, they weren't focused on other things they were busy focused on her impending death. So it's not like they didn't care or wouldn't have wanted things to be different. They just had legitimate distractions, and, you know, it was a lot more free range as well at that point than it is in life today with your kids. And by the time I ended up in prison, to be honest, I was pretty well prepared to be in prison. I knew a lot of people who were in there. They were people I had association with on the outside. I mean, one of my flatmates, you know, ended up being a cellmate with me for a while. It was a place where I knew a lot of people. I basically knew how it operated. It was the same types of rules that governed my existence on the outside as someone who was actively involved in crime and who, you know, had gang associations and all of that sort of stuff. But it was just a far more intense experience of it. It's interesting, you know, I remember going into prison, being on remand, and just getting as high as possible all the time so I didn't have to deal with the reality of that situation. It was interesting. I visited Mount Eden today before coming in here to go and visit someone as part of my work. And as a standard, they have a drug dog there that's checking every visitor. You know, they have a metal detector. They have all these things. That was not in place when I was in prison, I'll tell you. Yeah. I remember that prison and it being so easy to get drugs. It was just not a problem at all. And, you know, it's full of people with drug dependency, drug addiction issues, and drug dealers. So, you know, getting drugs wasn't a hassle. And that's just what I did. I just got as high as possible and had my trial, and certainly didn't represent myself as well there as I could have had I had a more sober approach to it, but I didn't. It was all too much for me.
You're 18.
Yeah, I was 18. I just couldn't deal with any of it, to be honest. You know, I was having a conversation with my brothers recently about when my mum was dying. She died 3 days before the offence, before I killed Boyd. And, you know, my brothers all rallied around and, you know, were there with her and, you know, did so much to try and support my dad. And I wish I could tell you that I did the same, but I didn't. I couldn't deal with it. I just withdrew. I didn't. Yeah. And prison was no different initially. I just didn't deal well with it. And then I got sentenced. I was convicted of murder. And it's interesting because, you know, again, I didn't believe that I was guilty of murder at the time. I thought, no, I'm guilty of manslaughter. I was attacked in my own house, all of this. But I absolutely was. You know, there was a point where I could have allowed him to leave my house. Instead, I chose to end his life. There's no question that I was guilty of that in my mind. And I remember getting sentenced and realizing that, okay, this is it now. It was interesting listening to Gordon Walker's interview because he talked about the Stockdale paradox. And I love Stockdale. I mentioned Stoicism earlier. Learning about Stockdale's journey of being a prisoner of war in Vietnam and his practice of Stoic philosophy. I was reading about that when I was in prison. And so it was something that I really got at a different level. And of course, that Stockdale paradox is the ability to be completely realistic about the reality of your situation, but still retain hope. And for me, I thought, okay, this is it. This is my life now. Forget about the outside, you know, forget about all of that stuff. And in fact, a lot of people, when they're in prison or sentenced to long periods in particular, will often refuse visitors. They don't want to have visits anymore. And part of that is that it reminds you of the outside. It keeps bringing that back into your life, whereas psychologically, it's actually easier to just focus on your new reality for a lot of people, to not have to deal with that stuff. And, you know, I had to come to grips with that. I was going to be doing at least 10 years. I was given a 10-year minimum on a life sentence. That was the lowest that the judge could give me at that point. And at 18, you don't have enough life experience to be able to contextualize 10 years. So for me, nearly 50 now, I know what 10 years is. Yeah. Whereas as an 18-year-old, I was like, okay, well, this is forever. So this is my new life now. But I was able to maintain some hope. Initially in those early years, that was the hope of escape. and I used to just constantly be looking at the walls, just be observing guard movements, all of this stuff, and just thinking, okay, the second I get the opportunity, or as soon as my security's lowered, then this is the plan. Fortunately for me, by the time I ended up lower security, which was a few years ahead of me, I had enough time under my belt that it made me reconsider the merits of escaping, because I was a few years through it. And also as well, when I started studying, then that gave me a different path. But yeah, that...
Was the show Prison Break on at that time?
I have no idea, man. I know the one you're talking about, but I have no idea. I never watched it. Yeah.
Because that'll be a lot of people's frame of reference is what they've seen through popular culture.
Yeah.
So I guess what's the biggest misconception that we might have about prison life?
Okay, the biggest misconception, in my experience, is that prison is just like a really well-resourced place where you get heaps of opportunities for rehabilitation. And, I laugh a little bit when I say it, because people who read my book are just like, what? It's so violent, it's so brutal. And, they don't have the resources. There are these small pockets of good things that are done, but the reality is they don't have the resource required to make that standard. So let me give you an example. The rehabilitation programs that are run, they triage who gets to go into those based on who is the least likely to reoffend. So what they do is they go, okay, you're not likely to reoffend, so we're going to put you in the program, and that's likely to be successful for you. But these people who are really high security and high risk of reoffending, that's not a good use of money and resource putting them in the program, so we're not going to do that. And it's because they don't have enough spaces on the programs. They don't have enough resource to put everyone through it. And of course, the irony there is a lot of the people who are really dangerous are often just released as opposed to having really gone through that stuff. That's my experience of it anyway. And, I think people, you just have this idea that, no, you go in there and it's all about rehabilitation and that. Absolutely. It's like, I don't know if you guys can remember when the fight clubs came out, when they, up in Mount Eden and that, it had been filmed.
Yeah.
And I remember watching the news and going, yeah, well, the only thing about that is there were phones to film it. There's nothing new here. You used to have to do compulsory yard time in the prison. First few years I was in there, and most of the prisons you do compulsory yard time. That's where you get put into these little concrete sort of like empty swimming pool style boxes, and it's so the guards can go through and search the cells at that time, but it's also, just part of how they do it. And that is just where so much violence used to go down. You've got all of these people who aren't good at regulating emotions, who have histories of violence, who are in this small confined space together. A lot of the time you'll have gang tensions and rivalries. You'll have the politics of the place. And you never know, what you might get caught up in if you associate with people who you don't know. I used to constantly be thinking, oh my gosh, you just don't want to be talking to anyone or even standing around anyone who you don't know really well, because that's a really good way to get yourself caught up in a conflict, caught up in violence.
Can you personally count how many times you were involved in violence? Was it a lot?
Oh, for me, it wouldn't have been that much. Probably like 6 to 10, I'd say.
And that's just fight, and that's just people attacking you,
or attempting to attack me, or getting into fights. And sometimes they were fights where it's like, okay, earlier on in my sentence, absolutely, if there were people who attempted to diminish me or dominate me, then that would absolutely be met with an escalation of violence, because that is what's required of you in the prison culture in order to be a respected member of that community. And if you are not a respected member of that community, you are going to have a very, very bad time. I look back on it and I go, I am so fortunate that I'm quite a physically big person and quite fit.
I did wonder that because whether that stands you in good stead.
100%. But also as well, I came from a background of having been in lots of fights from as early as I can remember. I'd done a lot of martial arts growing up. I knew how to fight. I'd been in many, many street fights as, part of my adolescence. In fact, I remember when I started school, my one ambition when I was a kid in school was always to be the toughest in my year. It was never to achieve academically or anything. That wasn't respected or seen or valued as far as I could tell. And so I was well equipped for that space.
So you get a reputation in the yard, like, he can handle himself. Don't try to walk over him.
Exactly. And that's the reputation you 100% have to have. And I was very fortunate that in my later years when I changed, I was already a known quantity in that respect. And that doesn't mean that people won't mess with you, but it means that people won't prey on you in the same way that they will someone who's perceived as weaker or someone who won't stand up for themselves and won't fight back. And so for me, I still, had people try and attack me in subsequent years and that, but that was more just them taking out their anger and aggression on me and I was handy, as opposed to instrumental violence. So instrumental aggression or violence is more calculated and deliberate, whereas someone, not getting their way at the guardhouse and then just seeing you and then just taking that out on you, that's a different thing. And so, I always feel, like small people who go into prisons, physically small people in that, that's a very hard situation.
I spoke to your brother Chris about that period of time. And I know he was overseas for a lot of the time you were there, but he did mention coming back maybe after 2 years into your sentence and noticing like a callousing of you as a person, like a hardening of you. And that's just, I guess that's just a product of the environment, right?
Yeah.
But do you notice that when you're in there that you are adapting to the environment? It's like a frog that's in that boiling water, right?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's so incremental and so insidious that you don't. I mean, that's what institutionalization is, right? It's when you go into an environment, an institution, and it transforms you into someone who now has the habitual behaviors, thinking, feelings, and responses that are consistent with that environment you're in. And I always think of it as comparable to sort of like being an eel, right? Being a tuna. If you get put into a contaminated river, you're going to imbibe all of that contamination. It's going to go within you. And that's what prison's like. It's an environment where you get contaminated by the social norms of the environment, what's considered to be appropriate action and behavior. What has you respected and accepted in the community? And it's exactly the opposite of the stuff that we would want, and I get people who are prison abolitionists in terms of the desire to not have prisons. I get it, but I also think they don't know the people I know. And I think the majority of people in prison are similar to myself and they want better. A lot of the time they don't know how to do that. One of the questions I often ask people in custody if I'm in that situation is, how confident are you that you know how to stay out? Like if you had to rate yourself 1 to 10, where 1 is no clue at all, 10 is 100% I know exactly how to stay out. I know what to do. I know how to live to stay out of prison. I always ask them, how confident are you know how to stay out? And then the follow-up question is, how willing are you to do the mahi, to do the work required to stay out? And you see some really differences in responses there. A lot of people don't know how to stay out. A lot of people will rate themselves like a 3 or a 4 in terms of their confidence of actually knowing how to stay out. This is particularly true if you're someone who's gone in really young. Like if you've ended up in youth justice residences at 12 or 13, something like that, then you can just really easily get on this treadmill of just continuous imprisonment throughout that developmental period and then just off to adult prison. So many people I was in prison with had gone through that path. It was all they knew. And so you'll get these people going, 3 or 4 on confidence, knowing how to stay out, but a 10 on wanting to stay out, but they don't know how to do it. You know who doesn't rate themselves as a 10 on wanting to stay out? People with massive drug addiction issues, because there'll often be people who go, yeah, I get it, but man, the drugs, and it's such an evil in terms of the way it captures people.
In the movie version, it would be 4 or 5 years in, maybe 3 or 4 years in, you would meet a mentor, a wise old soul, and you learn from
We
him.
got the movie version.
And you're skeptical at first, but then you realise the power of his ways.
Yeah.
How did the change look for you?
Yeah. Incremental is how it looked, but I definitely had exactly that movie version. When I was on remand at the same time as John Barlow, who was, ended up on his third trial, convicted of murdering Jean and Eugene Thomas in an assassination style, killing on the terrace in Wellington. He's always maintained his innocence. I personally think he probably is innocent based upon my experience of being in prison with him over many years and me just seeing how he reacts. And he's not someone who's ever struck me as someone who's just going to think that, killing a couple people is a good idea. And I came across him on remand when I was 18, and he, even at that point, was saying, you should do something with your time. Try and better yourself, try and study. But I was like, who's this guy? Let me just get high. All right. And that was sort of my attitude. But then later on, I came across him again when I was in Peremere, when I was in maximum security prison. And it was the same sort of message. What are you doing? You should think about doing some study. And I had also come across a guy there who really nudged me onto the path of education, and that was a guy, Ken Walsh, who was a member of the Hole in the Wall gang. And they were a very notorious group of organised criminals. In fact, they were the people who introduced ATM machine robberies to New Zealand, stealing ATM machines. They were very notorious as safe crackers. They were also the only people to successfully break some people out of Peremere, the only successful escape from that prison. And Ken was a very smart guy, they all were. And he was someone who shifted my attitude around what education was as well, because he was very smart and he was very educated, and I could relate to him. And so I had these messages from John, you should study, but I also saw this other guy who was really smart, knew a lot, and I saw the value in that. And so that helped shift me onto this path of trying to start to learn, to educate myself. And it wasn't with good intentions. We often think this thing that, what motivates people for rehabilitation is important. No, it's not. It absolutely isn't. You start taking the steps, you start demonstrating the behaviour, and then the thoughts and beliefs will follow. It's a mistake to think that you need to have the motivation and the belief and the right intent before you start the change.
Gordy Walker, same thing, eh? The gold medal behaviour. You need to act like the gold medalist before you get the gold medal.
Yeah, well, this is the same sort of thing. So I started, taking these steps towards education. And, the original word for educate means to lead out of the darkness of your own ignorance. And I started, not with good intent, but because I thought, well, this is a good way to spend my time, and, studying psychology would be a really interesting thing because I'll be like a mind reader, and that'd be really useful for me, because my obvious career path would be that when I get out, I'll import drugs. That's what I thought at that point when I was in maximum security prison as a 20-year-old, because you only know what you know. And I thought, okay, well, I'm a convicted murderer. I'm never going to get a job or anything like that. There's no chance for me, being normal in society. I'm making all these connections here now of people who are international drug traffickers and who are connected to them. So that's obviously what I'll end up doing. And, if I study psychology, I'll be like a way better drug dealer. That's what I thought.
On that scale you were talking before of people that you ask about, do you know what to do to stay out, or are you willing to stay out?
Yeah.
At that time, 2 years in, where are you on those two scales?
No clue really in terms of how to stay out. I mean, I had other people in my life, unlike a lot of people in prison, I did have people like, siblings and that who had jobs, who had careers. My oldest brother was in the army, which is something I had wanted to do, that sort of stuff. But the ideas of what I thought around how you could stay out, I thought those doors were all closed to me at that point anyway. So I wouldn't have had a real clue in terms of what I could do.
And there's nothing signalling that you have the opportunity to do something different at that stage?
Not at that point. No, nothing on my radar. You know, I think it would have been, an interesting question to ask myself at that point. I definitely would have been very willing to stay out of prison, that's for sure, but I wouldn't have known how to do it other than through crime, which is ironic, right? Because, of course, it's crime that gets you into prison. But I just wouldn't have had an awareness at all of other options. But then I started studying, and through that process, you know, my identity started to change. You know, I started to see myself in a different way as a different type of person, and I started to become aware of the different options available to me. And a key one there is that I started to identify as someone who loved learning, which I hadn't had that identity of myself previously. And I started to identify as someone who could feel a sense of pride in their knowledge as well, which is not something that I'd had previously. And I ended up doing an undergraduate degree in psychology and philosophy. And I loved philosophy. You know, I really did. But the difficulty with philosophy is it gives you the tools to critically evaluate your own beliefs and thoughts. And of course, you know, that shows you up a lot of the time.
Yeah, I wondered about your brain. Like, you're clearly a very intelligent person. Did you realize on this path that my brain actually works quite well? As you're studying, you're like, I can understand this better than most. I can articulate things. Like, did you start to realize the power of your brain?
Yeah, absolutely, through education. But I didn't have a comparison like that. So it wasn't like, I can do this better than most or anything. Yeah. Because what was my comparison? I was the only one studying. There was no one else around. I mean, it's so interesting, right? Like, I did so much study in prison. I was the first person to go through, do an undergraduate and then a master's degree entirely from within prison. I was the first person to start a doctorate in prison. But I'd never spoken to another student, you know, so I didn't have any comparison. I remember talking to Paul Inglet, who was such an important mentor for me, Dr. Inglet, in terms of what I ended up studying and in my career path and that. And I remember talking to him, and I'd talk about all of these great things, you know, Dante's bloody
He told me about
Divine Comedy or, you know, libertarianism. I'd be talking about all these things, and I'd be like, I can't wait to get out and just be having these conversations with people all the time. Because I assumed everyone, like, you know, had read the classics. I assumed everyone, like, could just talk to you about these deep things. And he's like, man, you're going to be disappointed.
He shared that with me. He goes, he's like, yeah, he read all the classics, Homer, Dickens, Plato. And he's like, and then he would want to engage with me with these things. And he was like, bro, I don't read any of this fucking stuff. I've got no idea about it.
It's such a wild ride to be going on in your, just in silo by yourself.
It was super lonely as well. Yeah. And like, if people would visit me, and, you know, Dr. Donald Stevens, who was looking at trying to get my case reopened and all of that sort of stuff, he used to come and visit me as well. And, Paul Inglet and that. And it used to be such an intense experience for them. Donald told me years later that he used to just walk away exhausted after he'd visit me because I'd just be like talking at him the whole time about what I'd been reading or learning because there's no one else I could talk to about that stuff. There were periods where I was in the same unit with John Barlow, and then I'd be able to talk to someone else about this stuff. But I mean, to give you an example, like there are so many words that I know the meaning of that I read that I had never ever heard pronounced. Like omnipotent, right? Obviously, omnipotent should be omnipotent.
Omnipotent,
right? Yeah. You know, just stuff like that. Yeah. And in fact, even still to this day, geez, I was doing a workshop maybe about a year ago or 2 years ago. And, you know, my background's social science, and variable is a really important word in terms of research. You know, you have these variables and you alter them and then you figure out what the outcome is. I up until I reckon 46 used to say variable instead of variable because, again, my whole education had been isolated and I just never realised that I was mispronouncing that word until someone in the workshop went, do you mean variable?
Yeah.
And I was like, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Again, there's no comparison and it was very intellectually lonely, but I was really lucky to have come across John as a mentor because he used to read and edit my assignments for me. You know, he was an educated person. He was someone as well who really believed in the noblesse oblige principle. And what I mean by that is that when he was in prison, because he was someone who came from a good upbringing and background and education and who had had a successful life, he spent a lot of time trying to help other people in terms of doing informal literacy and numeracy, classes with different people, helping them out, encouraging people to study, helping support them. And he really did feel within the prison environment that it was his obligation to try and help others in that way. I used to get really annoyed about it because in prison, the more people you associate with, the greater your capacity to get contaminated by their dramas, as I mentioned earlier. And so I'd regularly be saying to John things like, don't bloody bring home strays, don't be like seeing some poor waif, looks, and then bringing them to your cell. Because I go to your cell, I don't want to be around people who I don't know.
Yeah.
It's so funny too, because, if you think about personality, like you guys haven't known me long, but you're probably not shocked to hear that I'm quite an extroverted person. Okay, like I like talking to people, I'm friendly, all of that. In the prison environment, there's no capacity for that. You just, from a safety perspective, you just dial that right back. In fact, I didn't even realize that about myself really until I was released, because that environment just had such a big influence in terms of, distrust, suspicion, doing your best to be isolated from people, to just, again, avoid violence, avoid problems.
Just before we get to the release, it's a formal education, but how are you paying for that? How does that actually happen?
This is a really good question, actually, because the thing that people most often feel bad about with my story, when I say bad, unhappy about, will be, geez, didn't have to pay for his education in prison and this sort of stuff. The reason I was able to study is my dad paid for my education out of his pension, right? That's what he did. Out of his savings, out of his pension, he paid for my study. When I studied, it was before you could get student loans in prison or anything like that. The only reason I was able to study was because I had his support. That is a massive difference between me and most people in the prison system, is I had really good family support to enable that stuff. And, he used to take out my assignments to post them a lot of the time. The prison postal system was not something that could be relied on. It's interesting, the prison environment, right? I wouldn't have been able to study if it wasn't for a number of prison officers who really supported what I was trying to do, who made it happen, because it wasn't systemically supported when I was in. However, like any organization that employs large numbers of people, not everyone's going to be fantastic. And where you have a situation where there's a massive power disparity, the people who are less competent or less generous as human beings can get away with really screwing you over in a way that they couldn't in other situations. Things like, your assignment that you're trying to post out ending up in the bin, stuff like that. And so Dad, he would send that stuff out. He would bring me books, and he used to go to all the book fairs, like the Lions fairs and all that sort of stuff, all the old school fairs where they used to sell all the books. He would go to those and he'd buy collected works of Charles Dickens. Then he'd bring one of those books in for me every week and exchange it for the one I just had. And so he was such a massive, massive supporter. And Massey University as well, they changed a whole lot of the rules so it was possible for me to study. And my master's degree, that sort of thing. Again, I'm not sitting here because I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps. I'm sitting here because I had some amazing support and opportunities that most people don't get. You have to do the work yourself, but without that support, without those opportunities, without people who believe in you as well, right? I mean, I'm sure you guys have experienced that in different parts of your careers or lives, where you've had someone who's believed in you a bit more than you've believed in yourself, and just how powerful that impact is.
100%.
Yeah.
Definitely.
We're gonna start pulling you out of prison, but I am really
I'd appreciate that. Pull me out of prison. Get me out.
But to get there, I am really interested in those final days and even perhaps those final months. Questions I have is, are you at higher risk of someone trying to aggravate you in a way to reoffend to stay in longer? And I'm also interested in those final days or even the months, what the mindset is like when you've been in prison for a decade and you're starting to see the finish line.
Yeah, I think you do become high risk when people realize or understand that maybe you're starting to move on. Like, I would always be very, very quiet about any upcoming shifts to like a lower security unit or anything like that, because, you know, you just never know in a prison environment who might think, well, this is an opportunity to take a last shot at you or to settle some score you didn't even realize existed. Because when you're in a closed environment like the prison, you know, I think of it as people get demons in their heads, you know, people perceive things about you. And then from that point forward, they start ruminating on you, planning attacks on you. And it can be because they've got mental health issues. And it can just be because the prison is just such an ultra violent and suspicious environment where people are constantly on the lookout for any perceived slight. And so I'd be very quiet and careful about that when I was shifting. And I ended up in self-care before I was released, which was fantastic. And this is basically where you're like in a flatting situation inside the wire, so you can learn how to do your own laundry, learn how to cook and that sort of stuff. And that was fantastic because you're around other people who've done really long sentences who are at the end of them and who are preparing for release. And so the risk of violence in that environment is just so minimal compared to being in a mainstream unit where you've just got people cycling in and out. And as part of that, and part of the preparation for release, at the parole board's direction, I was doing home leaves. And this is where you go out for short periods and then you come back, and it was so hard. It was so emotionally difficult to come back to the prison after getting that taste of freedom. And every single time I would go out and get a home leave, I'd go for a swim in the ocean. Like, swimming was just the embodiment of freedom, you know? I just spent, you know, over 10 years taking showers, which is all good. But that ability to be immersed in water and like the ocean, I used to do it every time. I feel a bit emotional reflecting on that, actually. Yeah, it was pretty amazing, but incredibly difficult coming back. And I would just feel like this crushing like depression for days after getting back. And it would be because I was so excited, you know, about what life on the outside would be like. And then I would have to come back to this environment. And it was very, very difficult, yeah. It's interesting, though, like a lot of people, particularly those people who don't know how to stay out, are more comfortable in the prison environment. That's one of the things you see with institutionalization. And I see that with people when I'm in prison. I'm like, this person knows how it works. They're respected in here. You know, I see that. I get that. But it's such a detrimental thing. And I always say that to people when I'm in prison. If you think this is okay, this is just a sad indictment on the life you've had, that you don't know how much better things can be. But so many people in prison are like that. They've got no other frame of reference, right?
Do you get any sleep that last night? You're getting released the next day. What's that like?
Nah, that's not something where you're sleeping. And also as well, it's so funny. Like, I always think I'm such an impatient person. And if I didn't learn patience, you know, being in prison for over a decade, there's no shot. That's not going to be something I acquire. But I remember being in the holding cells waiting to get released. And just the sense of anticipation, you know, the holding cells for, you know, quite a while, everything moves slowly in the prison environment. And, you know, and you're just waiting for it to happen. I saw guys getting released today from Mount Eden coming out, carrying some apple boxes, you know, or some banana boxes you get from the supermarket with their stuff in it. And then I was like, oh, gosh, you know, I know what that's like. It's been a long time, but I know what that's like. Yeah, it's insane anticipation. And, yeah, it's a real transition, though. One of the things I always say to people is if you're coming out of prison after a long time, then your one and only job is just to get used to being out of prison. One of the biggest mistakes people make is trying to like catch up for lost time, you know, trying to do things too fast. Whereas the reality is we are so influenced by the environments we've been in. And if you've been in prison or any institution for a long time, you just have to recalibrate. You know, you have to learn what's required of you and how to operate in this new environment. And it's particularly true if you've been in through formative periods. You're way more prone to institutionalization if you've gone through transition periods, like being a child to an adolescent to an adult, because those are such important periods for you to figure out new rules as you progress in your life. So if you've been in institutions through those, you really do internalize whatever that environment is. And I always think the minimum you want to look at is like 1 month for every year you've been in, to expect it's going to take you at least 1 month for every year you've been in to just actually decontaminate and to just get used to this. But I actually think that's probably just to get you to an acceptable level of functionality. It definitely isn't over. Like if I think, I did nearly 11 years, it definitely took me way longer than a year to be more comfortable. But it's at least a year to just get over that initial high risk of going, oh my gosh, I just don't know how this works.
Because are you, when you're out, sizing everybody up that you're coming into interaction with and assessing threat?
Yeah, absolutely. It was one of the things I noticed on home leaves, actually. I mean, one of the first things I noticed is when I was in self-care, I got taken on an escorted shopping outing to go to the supermarket and get groceries with one of the guards, JR, Jim Reed, bloody legend, fully, I feel emotional. A staff member who always believed me and backed me, and did so much to make it possible for me to study. Anyway, he takes me on a leave to the supermarket. I just remember being mind blown by the colours, because I'd come from such an austere environment, which is the prison, and then just all of the colours on the shelves blew my mind. But I also remember the first time I got taken to a shopping mall, and it was when I was doing a home leave for a few hours with my father and one of my cousins, and I had exactly that situation. Walked into Queensgate shopping mall in Lower Hutt, and it was just too much, because in the prison environment, your natural thing to do is every single time you step out of your cell, you do like a threat assessment. You don't think about it. You just pay attention to where everyone is to see if there's any imminent threats to you as soon as you've stepped out of your cell. And I've been attacked stepping straight out of my cell before, so that helps motivate threat assessment. And you just do that as a habit. You don't think about it. And then I found myself in the shopping mall trying to look at everyone, and it was just overwhelming. It's just not something that you can do. But there's all these things that you do automatically in the prison that aren't functional once you're out, but you don't recognize those until you're out.
Did you continue? What did the doctorate timeline look like?
Yeah.
With prison and study and coming out, and when did you sort of get it, and how did that journey progress?
Yeah, so basically I was doing it full time, and I had done the first 2 years of it, 3 years full time, right? 3 to 5 years really. But I did the first 2 years of it in prison, done heaps, got out, and then did nothing basically for the next 5 years. And the reason is I was trying to learn how to live my life. I was working, I was trying to build a career for myself. I was doing all these other things. And it was very, very hard to prioritize sitting down and studying more. And to be honest, I'm not sure it would have been completed if it wasn't for the masterful influence of Dr. Paul Inglett, who knew me very well and said to me at one point about 5 years, into being released, and said, you should just quit. You're not going to finish that. And knowing me as he does, he knew that was going to get finished now. There's no way I was going to quit on that. I'm not someone who quits on things that served me poorly in the past when my focus wasn't a positive one. It got me into a lot of trouble. But at that point in my life, I was like, right, okay, I'm going to take 3 months unpaid leave, and I am just going to smash this. And that's what I ended up doing. And, that opportunity to do the Viva, where you defend your PhD, they don't do that for all of them now, but it's such a rite of passage. And this is where you have the people who have been marking it and that, and there's like a panel, and they're asking you these questions like, why did you do this? Why didn't you do this? And you have to stand and you have to defend this massive piece of research you've done. Fantastic. what a cool thing to do. And what a contrast between having to do that same sort of thing with the parole board to convince them to let you out, right?
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, I'd never thought about that before, but it's similar experience, but so different, eh?
Yeah. Were you, prior to finishing the master, were you like 9 to 5? Were you in a 9 to 5 job?
No. Like, when I got out, the company I worked for at that time had very high expectations of how much work you would do. And so, a couple of times I was taken out for coffees to tell me I had the wrong attitude because I wanted to go home at finish time as opposed to be there doing extra work. And that certainly wasn't an attitude that was shared across all the leadership, but that was an attitude that, came to the fore for me. So there was high expectations on what you delivered. And it was the best learning environment ever for me. We often hear this thing, work smarter, not harder. That's only something you have the luxury of doing once you have experience. When you're young, you just need to work as hard as you can. You just need to clock as many hours as you can to get the experience that will then later on enable you to be smarter about how you approach things. When you haven't had the experience, work smarter. No, just go and do heaps of work, learn, get exposed to things. And I was so lucky that I got so much opportunity to do things and to do different things and to be believed in a way that's enabled me to really, I think, get pretty good at what I do today as a direct function of those opportunities that I had earlier on.
You referenced the journalist who sat on the story for 5 years. How much of that was playing in your own mind when you're in interactions now that you are in the workplace about this is going to come out, or should I front foot it? Should I leave it?
Yeah.
How do you navigate that?
It was the sword of Damocles. It really was. Like, I'd be having interactions with clients where I'm happy with the quality of the work I'm delivering. It feels like a strong relationship. And then it would just cross my mind going, I wonder how they'd react if they knew about my background. And so it felt that I wasn't really living an open or authentic life, because I wasn't living an open life. But also as well, that was appropriate. When I worked for this organisation, when I worked for Opera, I'm not Paul Wood. I'm an employee of that organisation, and my job is to represent their values and, their commitment to excellence. And so I always felt it wasn't my place either to bring up that sort of stuff. Because, again, my job is to deliver for them. It's so interesting. There's a whole lot of work around this area called identity fusion. And it's something which can lead to the worst types of behaviors, but it can also lead to really positive stuff. And I experienced that through my study and through my work with Opera. When I worked for them, I didn't just identify as an employee. I felt a deep sense of emotional connection to them as a company. And that was in part because of Dr. Paul Engler and because of Dr. Sarah Burke, who were the founders and who I have an internal debt of gratitude towards. And so, for me, it was like, the equivalent of someone who's like a hard-out football hooligan, or someone who, they're so in love with their identity in terms of their football club. Well, I was like that for the company I worked for, part of that was the opportunity they'd given me, part of that was the amazing experiences I had in that belief, and just that feeling that I was part of something that was really, really cool. Yeah.
Part of fitting into groups and culture is humour.
Yeah.
At what point are you able to not joke, I don't know, I'm tiptoeing around it, but you know what I mean?
Go on.
I'm out now.
Yeah.
I think Paul shared with me a story of you've made a cake or something for the staff, and they've walked in
There's a knife.
and you're standing there with a knife in your hand. Do you know what I mean?
That's in self-care, by the way. You can't bake cakes or hold knives in standard prison, right?
Well, I thought it was like when you were on the outside.
Oh, no, this was in self-care.
Righto.
One of the things Opera did, and they were so smart in terms of how they transitioned me into employment, is they got all the senior managers to come out and meet me while I was still in prison, so that people would already know me as a person, as opposed to, like just having me as a stereotype where they haven't actually humanized me. And one of the things that was done is all the senior leaders had come out and visited me in the prison, and used to bake cakes. So it's pretty funny stuff like that, and stuff you don't even think about and realise, I remember as well being like at a visit once, and I was sitting next to another guy who I was inside with, and it was his visitors, and we're having a chat. And, again, I was like reading heaps, so I had views and ideas. And I remember one of the visitors like expressing a view and me going, oh, I disagree with that, and, expressing my view, what do you think? And them going, well, I'm not going to say anything. You're a murderer. I don't know what you might do.
Yeah.
And again, like for me just being like, And I do still think about that sometimes, not very often now, right? Like I'm just getting on with my life, but sometimes I do sort of think, how is that part of my story perceived by some people? And, and by some people, it's a negative they'll never be able to get over. And by the way, that is completely legitimate as well. Like if you've been a victim of violent crime, if you've had any negative experiences there, it's completely legitimate that you might be listening to this going, I don't like this guy. This guy shouldn't have been given those opportunities. He should have just been punished while he was in prison. And I get that. But as someone who likes to be liked by other people, it's always a bit of a tension to manage.
Where do you stand on second chances? Because that's such an interesting topic.
Yeah. Well, like I'm a firm believer in them, right? I'm a firm believer in second chances. Otherwise, like I wouldn't be here today. One of the things I love about New Zealand is the fact that I've had an opportunity to come back and create another life for myself. One where hopefully, I can not only claw back some of the harm I did previously, but I can thrive. I can do things that matter to me. I can have a fantastic wife and just kids who have really given me the experience of what it is to truly love, like the love you have for your kids and getting to experience them growing up. Oh, it's just absolutely amazing. I think where there are no second chances, that's just when there's no hope. And where there's no hope, there's no perseverance. Where there's no perseverance, there's no character. There's just the worst of us.
I want to introduce Mary, your wife, who you've been with.
Marianne. It's a double banger.
Oh, Marianne. But it kind of leads into that, and it's kind of what we've been talking about is dating, coming out of prison and dating and women and front-footing this kind of thing that once you bring up is going to cause problems. And I spoke to Marianne about how she Googled you after the first date and kind of had to deal with it. But that must have happened before then as well, right?
Yeah, and it's very hard to know. It's one of those things where you're never 100% sure what's behind something when you have that type of background where it's kind of like, let me give you an example. There was one point where I was homeless for a period. And the reason is not because I couldn't afford, to live somewhere, but because no one wanted me as a flatmate, which is completely understandable, right? I'd go along to these flats and I'd get on really well with the people and I'm a professional and I'm earning money and that. But I would always feel an obligation to let them know about my background. And the reason is the worst thing would be to move in somewhere and then have someone find out about my background and to be like in fear in their own home, right? Because of that. And so there's no way I would be responsible for that. So and by this stage I'd like done a TED talk, I'd done all these things. So what I'd do is I'd go, look, just want to make you aware of this. And I'd send them a link to my TED talk because I'd think, that's quite a way and, good way to sort of do it, eh? And I'd always get, oh, hey, it was really nice to meet you. Oh, we've actually gone with someone else, And I'd be like, okay, well, look, that's a lot of flats and a lot of people have gone with someone else, even though maybe there was no one else there, And so you'd suspect that, but you can never entirely be sure, right? And it's the same with, let's say, women and that sort of thing, for example. Oh, okay, that person never returned my message or whatever. Is that because they found out about my background or they just don't like me? There's a lot of uncertainty there to navigate that I think was pretty difficult. But also that consideration of, hey, when do I let someone know? And by the way, there are some people who have gotten out after life sentences and that as well, very long periods of time, where, you know, I provide a bit of support and mentoring for them in exactly these types of conversations. Yeah. And my attitude has always been that, like, if you have a serious interest in someone, then, you know, you've got to let them know as early as possible. But also as well, not too early, right? Like, it's not like a first date thing.
Well, yeah.
Hey, let me know.
Here's something interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I would suggest it would be something that you'd want to think about before that person was too emotionally involved with you, you know, whatever that looks like. And I often think as well, and I was talking to someone else about this recently too, is in many respects, it's a good mechanism to identify the types of people you want to be around and those that you don't anyway. So for me, like, I'm someone who 100% believes in people's capacity for positive change and growth, and I believe that, you know, people can make mistakes and can come back from this. And I also believe this. I believe the most sincere form of regret for previous mistakes is your behaviour today. And I think if people don't believe in that, then they're not people who I want an association with anyway. And so that's okay. You know, I want to be around people who believe in getting better and believe that's possible. So, you know, if you ended up sharing with someone that this was your background and it was an issue for them, then that's fair enough, but that's not the person for you, and that's okay as well. Yeah. A difficult one to navigate. There's no easy answers there.
The prison to PhD story, right? You get your doctorate, you do the TED Talk.
Yeah.
You're obviously a brilliant speaker, captivating speaker. Does that sort of set off this chain of events that is sort of what you become? You lean into the public speaking, or is that more recent? Like, what are the timelines looking like on it?
Yeah, the TED Talk was the beginning of that. I mean, I look at it now, of course, that's like 12 years old or something like that. I look at it and I'm like, if I had the chance to redo that today, I would just crush that in such a different way. I mean, one of the things, for example, is...
Which is crazy because it's a really good TED Talk.
Yeah, but that's relative to where you're at, right? So if you think about this, so I've been doing, you know, many TED Talks a year for over a decade, and I am all about the unrelenting pursuit of excellence in what I do. When I do something, I reflect on it afterwards and I go, okay, what did I think worked well there that I'd want to replicate or do again? Is there anything that I could have done slightly differently that would have improved things? I've been doing that for 10 years. So I'm a lot better now than I was 10 years ago as a function of that, right? And like, I look at that too, like, one of the things I think that I'm good at as a speaker is injecting humour. Because what I'm talking about is pretty heavy for a lot of it. So it's really important to inject humor. But also humor is often about being taken down a path and then getting surprised at the direction it goes. And, you know, the type of stuff I'm talking about, because there is some heaviness to it, it's exactly the sort of thing that lends itself well to humor. Whereas if I look at that TED Talk, there's no humor in that because, you know, this is me for the first time publicly speaking about my story in front of people. I'd never done it before, that TED Talk. And that's 2,000 people. Yeah. The first time.
Wow.
And so it was a really good effort for where I was at that point. But as someone who's getting after and trying to be the best I can be at, you know, what I do, I look at that and I go, yeah, it was good for the time, but I would do that differently now, you know?
So across the last, 5-10 years, you're doing the speaking, but you're also upskilling. And I'm interested in sort of picking away at some of the things you're doing more recently. Like, you've been doing some work with the Advanced Police Negotiation Team. Are you able to talk about this and what you're doing?
I won't get into any of the specifics around any of the work that I do with groups like that or others, but one thing I would really like to say is that the fact that I have the opportunity to work with the police or any of the groups in the police is such a bloody endorsement of who the New Zealand police are, because I was someone who, as an adolescent, was an active bloody hassle to the police. I wasn't just someone who, you know, was committing crimes and hoping the police wouldn't notice. I was deliberately antagonistic to the police. You know, I was someone who really did see it as a kind of like a battle with the police. You know, that was my mindset at the time. And so based on that and based on my offences when I was younger, the police are an organisation that would have every legitimate reason to want to have nothing to do with me. And yet they give me the opportunity to do work with them, to add value to them. And I bloody love adding value to them. You know, the police, that is such a hard space to be in. And it's such a great bunch of people. The majority, right? Any large organisation, you're going to get some people who are, you know, less capable than others. That's fine. But the police I know are people who are really doing important work in a hard space, who are massively under-resourced. And the fact that they're even willing to work with me is such an endorsement of who they are.
You've also done some work alongside the Special Air Service as well.
As a function of the second book that I wrote, I had the opportunity to go and observe the SAS doing some of their training, and I'll tell you what, the Special Forces community in New Zealand, the SAS, the FET, the Female Engagement Team, the enablers who aren't part of those groups, but who are the intel people, the logistics people, all the people who make it possible for the Special Forces community to operate. You know, they're just such an amazing, great bunch of people who are giving up the opportunity to be earning a lot more money in the private sector or elsewhere to serve our country and to just really do the best job that they can do for us as a nation in this area. And I'll tell you what, like the people who I've had the opportunity to interact with as a function of that book, you know, super smart. You know, people who are in the Special Forces, people in the SAS, you know, these are very smart, capable people. That's a big part about what it's about, is the ability to be adaptable and to be effective regardless of the circumstances you find yourself in. And so, yeah, look, I've loved having the opportunity to interact with those people. I tell you what, every time I go away and I bloody train harder the next day. I run faster, I lift more, because it's so inspiring to be around anyone who's just really at the sharp end of anything, getting after it. And it's the same, like, you know, I've worked with all sorts of people in different industries who are just really brilliant at what they do. And it's so bloody inspiring. You know, the old adage that you're the sort of sum total of the 5 people you spend most of your time around. I think that's very true, but I also think just exposure to how great we can become as people in the different areas that we focus on, and exposure to people who just have insane work ethic and dedication is just so bloody inspiring.
So for those of us that don't get that opportunity, how do we glean little pieces of information from there that you've been able to, how do we filter that through aside from buying the book? or is that the only way? Are we buying the book?
I had to resist saying that.
I'll say it on your behalf.
But I mean, look, it is so cool though. And look, and one of the things I want to say about them, the reason they gave me access, and they are a very closed community, you know, the reason they gave me access is because they are people who wanted knowledge around the skills that they use, the tools they use to cope effectively under pressure, to be available to the New Zealand public. And that's why I was given that opportunity. They are incredibly generous. They're a great bunch of people, but they're a very closed community. So, you know, the book obviously is an option. But look, I think there's lots of stuff out there now, and I think we want to be able to make the most of the information that's available to us via the internet and other such things, to perhaps give us exposure to people who we may not get to see otherwise or hear from. I've got a good idea. Maybe you listen to this podcast and you get to hear some of the most amazing people. Like, I was so humbled to get the opportunity to be here, you know, going through, listening to your episodes, and, you know, the quality of the people involved and getting to hear how they think. That's exactly the type of thing to do. You know, the old adage was you're the sum total of the 5 people you spend most of your time around, whereas, you know, the modern joke is it's probably the 5 podcasts you most listen to. So I do think that that's a really good vehicle for most people. And I do think that benchmarking is important. One of the problems is if you come from a less opportune background or you've spent time in prison and that is your social comparison and your benchmark is people who really haven't achieved. And so that can give you a false sense of your own value. Whereas, you want to have people ahead of you who keep you pushing in terms of how great you can be, rather than to be around people who make you feel that you're the top of the tree.
You mentioned a line earlier that I'm keen to dig into a little more. I've never heard it described like this, but I'm sure there's heaps to get into. Is life as an ongoing experiment in the pursuit of excellence? What can the everyman or every woman take from that?
I think the idea that it's about progress, not perfection at any point, right? It's not about being good at stuff all the time, but trying to get better at stuff. And implicit within that idea is that it's okay to fail. It's okay to try stuff out that doesn't work. Because if you think about it, an experiment, right? And this is a concept that you use in leadership development, really, this experimental mindset where you go, I'm going to go out and I'm going to put the lab coat on in terms of my life, and I'm going to try to do something different, and then I'm going to observe the results. And I'm not going to put a whole lot of weight on it. Like if you're conducting research, if you're an experimenter, you're not going, oh my gosh, is it working? You're not putting a lot of emotional weight on it. You're dispassionate. You're going, right, we're going to try this. We're going to see what the results are. Okay, that didn't work. That's useful to know. That narrows it down. Let's try something else. And I think that's a really healthy way to give yourself the emotional capacity to take risks, to try new things out, and to not beat up on yourself if they fail, but to recognize that even a failure is progress because it helps direct you in a way that's going to be more effective for you. And so I'm always trying to do like little tweaks, little different things. Like I know you're into cold water, right?
Done his research, man's done his research.
No, I know this. No, just look at that beard game. And I'm just like, that's got to be cold water. Hey, there's cold water behind that. But anyway, like I've been in the cold water as well. Oh, the best is when it's natural, right?
Oh, hello. Now you're talking my language.
Oh, my golly. Like some of the, rivers that I've been in the French Alps or the Italian Dolomites.
Now he's trumped me.
Amazing. Much better than the prison yard, I'll tell you. But anyway, one of the things that I've done in terms of experimenting, for example, with the cold water is I used to just do it as part of my morning routine. But now what I do is I use it tactically to give me a dopamine boost in the evening, because there's all sorts of health benefits associated with cold water. But for my interest in neuroscience, dopamine helps us stay focused, helps us perform at a higher level, helps us have energy. I don't need that first thing in the morning. It's go time first thing in the morning. I need that after work when I'm starting to get tired and grumpy with my kids. That's when I'm like, it's cold water time. And I notice a distinct difference in terms of my ability to be present, to be patient, to be less ho-ha, less grumpy and tired when I do that. But that's because, again, I've got this mindset, which is, let me see where I can get additional margin. Let me try things out in a different way and then see what happens and what works and what doesn't, and then adapt accordingly. And I'm just doing that every day in different ways. And a big part of that, though, is that I have a system with that morning template that I use that helps me. I forgot to mention when I was doing that very brief morning account earlier, that one of the things I actually do on that is I have an experiment section where I write down what experiment I'm currently doing for the 21-day block I'm in. Yeah. So 21 days is generally how long it takes to notice any sort of real impact from something you're doing. Now, they used to think it was 21 days to change a habit. On average, it's about 90 days. But within 21 days, you normally notice the impact of something new you're doing, and you've built momentum on it as well. So I'm constantly doing like these 21-day blocks. And again, for me, the goal this year for me is to be a weapon. And I tell you this right now, when I first came out of prison, I felt like a weapon. Like I was like, there's nothing that can touch me. There's nothing that can happen to me that I can't cope with. Prison was really good as an experience to give me confidence in my resilience and ability to cope. And I was super physically fit. I was super smart because I'd been exercising my brain every day. There was nothing to do but read the classics. I could just quote anything, you know. I could quote Shakespeare. I could quote whatever it was. I was super sharp. I felt like a weapon. But here's the thing. I was an individual. I wasn't part of a family. I didn't have any intimate relationships. And then, as part of my journey, I discovered love with my wife. I didn't really know what love was before I'm going to get emotional again. I did not really know what it was to love or be loved until I met my wife. And then I discovered that, and we had kids, and I slipped. I slipped in terms of this feeling like a weapon. I got busy with life. I, was trying to do all these things that you have to do when you've got young kids. And I had experienced some injuries. I had some back problems, so I wasn't exercising as much. And I got to this point where I was like, I'm not feeling totally in control of my life. I feel like I've kind of slipped. And I'm spending all this time doing all these workshops for other people around all these good things that you can do. And then what happened is I decided I'm going to get that feeling back, but in a different way now. I'm going to get that feeling back as part of this unit, which is my family. I'm going to be a weapon in terms of being a father, in terms of being a husband, in terms of my career. I'm going to have this broader sense of being in total control of my life and being able to show up how I want to show up, that also now encompasses these other so important people to me. But I know that feeling from the past. But the terrain's changed, right? Because I know how to feel like a weapon if it's just me. But with family and with these other people as well, that requires further experimentation in terms of how can I just really dial that up as much as possible. And I think one of the things that really motivated me too is that, I had filmed and then launched the mental fitness program, this online program. I'd done the book, and that's great, but not everyone reads books. And also as well, I don't know about you, but often when I read like a self-help type of book, I'll read it, but I won't extract that much value from it because I've read it like a book, and then I just won't go through and do everything from it. Whereas I thought, okay, well, I'm going to create this online course, and it's going to have all this great stuff, great exercises, short clips, all this, and it will be really designed to reach people who may not read books, but also to be better to implement in an incremental way. And so I did this and I designed this, and it actually made me think, I've got all of this stuff I know in this really important area that I'm not actually implementing as a habit, that I'm not doing on a regular basis. And I guarantee you guys are the same, right? There's heaps of stuff you could be doing that you're just not living and breathing. Yes. And so that really motivated me to go, no, I want to recapture that feeling, that weapon feeling. And I'd already been doing work for years in terms of experimenting with my morning protocol and that, and having this experimental mindset. But this, and really trying to live and breathe the content of that course that I know adds so much value to other people, myself, has really helped me be on that path in an accelerated way. And that's where the 21-day blocks come from as well.
So this is an online course people can access now, mental fitness course. Where can they find it?
Look, if you go to my website, paulwood.com, you'll be able to find it there under the courses. If you Google Dr. Paul Wood mental fitness course, you'll be able to find it. It won't be a problem. And it's something I'm really proud of. It's interesting, like how your different life experiences contribute to you being good where you are now, even though you never could have predicted it. So the public speaking definitely has made me more aware of the skill set involved in presenting things, but also COVID. Over COVID, everything moved from being in person to being online. And so I spent a lot of time experimenting with different ways to be really engaging online, because it's such a different medium and it's so hard to keep people's attention. And I'll tell you what, I had some great help too. John O'Pryor, right? The comedian, Jono. Yeah. I remember texting him during COVID going, hey, what are your ideas around like how to be humorous and engaging? doing it online. And he's like such a generous dude, eh? Jono and Ben, honestly, bloody legends. So and so he'd send me back going, oh, hey, try this out. And so I'd experiment around how to be really engaging and how to inject humour when you can't see other people and you can't hear any feedback in that. And that, plus all of my academic background in this area, just lent itself, I think, to being able to create a really engaging, really practical course to help people get better at, bouncing, resilience, but also all the SAS stuff in that in terms of when the heat is on, when the kids won't go to bed or put their shoes on, when the bullets are flying, what are the tools that you've got to perform effectively there? But then also as well, how do you just boost that general positive emotion, spring in the step on a daily basis? And I really do feel proud of what was done there and that it just brought together all these different strands of what I'd had to learn to do and experiment with that I never predicted would come out in this way.
I'm sitting here
man,
trying to reconcile, you are a showman, natural showman.
I'm a show pony on the loose.
You're high energy, you're incredibly good at delivering your message, and I'm trying in my brain to compare and contrast to what you would have been like inside. And I'm finding it so hard. And I had a question for the end, but it's bugging me. So I want to ask it now.
Go on.
Does that other part of your life just feel like it's not even you?
Yeah. It really is such a strange thing. I feel like I grew up in an environment and then I was imprisoned in an environment where I never had the opportunity to actually discover who I was. It's like I look at I got to get emotional again. There's no shortage of emotion in this session today, but I look at my 10-year-old, my eldest boy, and he is such a performer as well, and I look at him and I go, wow, that is so what I'm like, but he's growing up in an environment where that's encouraged and that's okay. He's grown up in an environment where if he wants to do bloody, drama or whatever, that is all good. Whereas I didn't come from a time where that was acceptable, for a male. I didn't come from a time or a place where, you were going to go and do drama without getting beaten up for it, and all of this. So I think I had these ideas of who I was supposed to be that weren't really consistent with who I am. And I think this is such an interesting idea too, is that I mentioned earlier that personal identity is really porous. It can really change depending on your circumstances and what you're exposed to. But I also think it's emergent in the sense that I think you need to expose yourself to a variety of different circumstances and situations before you even discover who you are. I don't think that most of us can just know that. I think we discover it through experience. And I think that's such an important idea, particularly for young people today, is like, don't think that you need to have it all planned out. Go out and explore and take opportunities and you will discover who you can be at your best. When I started work, I used to have to write psychometric reports for recruitment. So, people who are applying for jobs, they complete a personality assessment, cognitive ability assessment. I'd be sitting there on the computer writing these. I had no idea that what I do now even exists as a job. Definitely not when I was studying in prison and not when I first started working. But I got these opportunities to deliver training in front of groups of people. And then I was like, oh, okay. Turns out I'm good at this. Turns out I like this. I had no idea about that. And again, in prison, I was someone who was quiet unless you knew me. If you knew me, not quiet, but I would associate with very few people because it's such a dangerous environment. So, yeah, who I am now has been an ongoing discovery.
And with that in mind, do you think you'd be who you are now had you not gone inside?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, eh? I would say no. I think, your experiences, all of them are so formative, right, in terms of who you become. And I think there are multiple versions of who you can be depending on what your life experiences are, but also how you choose to perceive those and what you choose to take from them, right? And, I think one of the things I've had to accept, even though I hate it, is that having been in prison and been in prison for that long was a good experience for me. It was not pleasurable at the time. It was traumatic. It was challenging. It was all sorts of things. But out the other side of it, I feel I'm better off as a result of the experience. I mean, like anyone who knows me will know that that's what's called post-traumatic growth. You know, you come out the other side and you feel you're better off as a result. It also is something where, had I not gone to prison at that time, I would have highly likely died of a drug overdose or something similar as a result of the lifestyle that I had. There's a great quote from Cormac McCarthy, the author who wrote the book, No Country for Old Men. And in the book version, I don't think it's in the film version, but in the book version, there's a line where he says, "You never know what worse luck your bad luck saved you from." And I really relate to that.
Man, this has been such a cool episode, Paul. How old are your boys?
7 and 10.
7 and 10. Our audience skews male.
Yeah.
They're a bit older. There's a lot of dads listening.
Yeah.
I feel like you're going to have a good answer for this. I'm going to go for it. What are your parenting hacks or advice, or what have you learned about yourself from being a dad?
I'll tell you what, actually, I think I'm going to give you the biggest parenting insight, which is a really crucial one. And I think it's a really liberating one, and that's important. And that is, actually, you have nowhere near as much impact on who your kids become as you think you do, and that you can actually dial down the worry around that. You can be more self-accepting that, you know, you're not going to be perfect as a parent. And in fact, I think one of the best things that I teach my kids, not only in terms of my life journey and what I do now, but also in terms of, you know, how I address the mistakes I make, is that I role model learning and trying to get better as a person. I explicitly communicate to them about things where I feel I haven't done as good a job as I would have liked to with them. Take ownership of that and take ownership of improvement. And I don't put too much weight on it. I try to be quite self-accepting around who I am as a parent. And part of that is because I know the research around this. And the research is just simply that, you know, you're not an engineer of your kids. You don't get to design who they become through your behavior. You're a shepherd for your kids. And that's your job, is to just try and encourage these fantastic human beings who come out, you know, really strongly influenced in respect of who they'll be through the genetic shuffle that you and your partner have given them. And your job is to just try and shepherd them into healthy pastures where they're going to flourish and where the best version of them is going to come out. You know, the little things you do, you know, are not going to have as big an impact on them as you might worry, or as much as a psychologist might get them to pay for in years of couch therapy later on. And so I think that's quite a liberating idea. But I think, again, for me as a parent, I think the way I manage my energy is one of the most important hacks that I've learned, and to focus on what I can control, which is often myself, not my kids. Giving myself time out as opposed to giving my kids time out is a really good one. Also, as well, I'm very lucky that my wife is just awesome and we're an awesome team together. And I really lean on her when I'm struggling to just tag her in and just tag out, and to accept that, you know, that's the way that relationships work if you're lucky enough to be raising kids together. There's this old idea, which I love. I think it's a Buddhist one originally. Who knows? But the idea is that when you're in a marriage or when you're in a relationship, you're both carrying water. You know, those old yokes with water buckets on either side, like you watch kung fu movies in the 80s and that, the 1,000 Stairs, all that sort of stuff. Well, you're both carrying a yoke with water buckets on either side. But there will be points where one person in the relationship can't carry all of their water, and then it's the other person's job to carry some additional water for a while. And who needs the water carried will shift and change at different points in the relationship. But that's what you're signing on for. You're not signing on to be super parent who can just do it all the time. You know, and again, that's something which really relates to when there's two of you. I have just insane respect for solo parents. You know, and there are some situations where kids are better off, you know, in a solo parent situation than with two parents together, particularly when there's massive instability in the household as a result of conflict or other challenges that people experience.
My hunch was right. That was one of the most comprehensive answers I've ever had.
Oh man, sorry, I just
No. Let me say that I'm going to wrap up. Did you have any else? I think we said at the start this was going to be a journey, and perhaps more than any other episode, we didn't have a rigid structure. It was more just about asking questions. But I've learned so much from your unique journey. Like, it's such a unique ride, right? And you've got such a unique perspective. But what you have turned your life into from where it was is just incredibly inspiring. And I think hopefully by the emotion that you showed in the episode, it's just a painful retelling of the same story over. I feel like we got to some interesting places.
Yeah, that really caught me off guard, and I mean, that's cool. It was, that's just a real human experience. And how amazing to be able to have a connection with you two so quickly, and that's a testament to you two as interviewers, awesome.
There will be people out there listening that do have a past that they feel still defines them.
Yeah.
What would you say to those people?
I would say no one's thinking about you or your past as much as you are, and that actually the people who are the people you want in your life will be the people who judge you on how you behave today rather than what you may have done in the past. And the people who judge you forever on your past, those aren't the people to have in your life.
You made mention before of being super energized after spending time with some of our country's finest.
Oh, yeah.
I feel exactly the same having spent time with you this afternoon, just energized to look at things differently and reassess, and that constant assessment of where you're at is something that you've imparted on me today about just refining what you do and how you do it, but constantly looking for those little improvements that you can make. It's been an amazing conversation.
Yeah, wicked.
There's been so many mic drop moments in this one, but thank you so much for coming and joining us. It's been epic.
Pleasure.